I'm not so sure a lot of times that people understand that each congregation of the churches of Christ that was started by the Apostle Paul was literally and actually an extension of him and his love for Jesus Christ. As we've studied in the book of Acts, we find that the Apostle Paul went through what we now know as 3 evangelistic crusades. And he went up through and around the Mediterranean and twice, and this third time that he went was into Spain and England. And every time he would go, he would start congregations of the churches of Christ. And as he went the second evangelistic time, he went with Titus and he went with Timothy, and they went back to check on the churches or the branches or the extension of the Apostle Paul's preaching in the towns in which these congregations started. A branch of the Apostle Paul could be related to what Jesus said in John 15. I am the vine, and ye are the branches. As Jesus was the source of life and the source of spiritual information, the apostles then would grow off of that trunk of that tree, of which Jesus was said to be the part that went in to receive the nourishment of the earth and gave them life. And these branches would extend forth from that tree, and then the tree would bear forth fruit. The fruit was the results of the preaching of the disciples in John 15 from the ministry of Jesus Christ that was given as he was the tree from which that life came. The same thing would be true of the Apostle Paul. There's a letter to the Church of Christ at Corinth. Paul had spent about 18 months in the city of Corinth and had preached the gospel day and night. And so the Church of Christ that existed there was a branch. Now that didn't mean that Paul owned it. That didn't mean he lorded over God's heritage, or he thought himself some pope or some higher up, so that somebody had to bow down and kiss his ring every time he walked in the door. That didn't mean that when he went into the assembly, they started saying, Hail Paul, Hail Paul. No, not that at all. For Paul said, I determined not to know anything amongst you, 1 Corinthians 2:2, save Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's all the information that I ever preached, he said. That's all I ever gave you. I gave you the source of life from life himself, and that's Jesus Christ. And as the Church of Christ was started, when Paul would leave, he would leave that congregation in the town in which he started it, and they would preach the gospel and win souls to Christ and grow as the grace of God allowed them by the preaching of the word. Then he would go to another town. There was the Church of Christ at Colossae. There was the Church of Christ at Philippi. There was the Church of Christ at Rome, which, by the way, was started before Paul got there. But when he got there, he increased their strength and their information in the will of Jesus Christ to allow them to be sanctioned or to be settled, rooted, and grounded in the faith. They didn't belong to Paul. He wasn't their priest or pope or higher up. He was just Brother Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ and a servant of the Lord. So for someone to let on like that the church is a branch of somebody else is to misunderstand what a branch in reference to the use of it in the scriptures would be discussing. The branch would be the end result of the preaching of one who had the primary use or information of the gospel. That's why it would come from the apostles. Jesus said in Matthew 19:28, in the regeneration, when the Son of Man shall be seated on the throne of his glory, ye, apostles as understood, will be seated on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. He said, as he commissioned the apostles, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." In Mark 16:16, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned." Jesus had given them the marching orders. That was the work of God. They carried it throughout the world as a limb off of the tree. There was fruit that came off of that limb, are those branches, the apostles, that bore fruit in bringing about new members of the churches of Christ. Now, this idea that somebody thinks that because they originated a congregation or started a group gathering together that they are lords or gods or a pope or some cardinal or some high official is completely contradictory to what Jesus taught in the example of washing the disciples' feet. He wanted to show them to be great in the kingdom of heaven was to serve, not be served. To be as he was exhibiting himself before the disciples, washing their feet, not them washing his feet. Did he deserve to have his feet washed? Why, sure. But the thing he was doing was showing by example that they should be as he, and that is, serve one another, not to think of themselves more highly than they ought, not to be vainly puffed up, not to have a swollen head and thinking they were some big high muckety-muck or official in the churches of Christ. There was and is no such animal. Then each congregation that was started by the Apostle Paul had no allegiance to Paul, but allegiance to Jesus Christ. Paul didn't teach them concerning himself. He taught them concerning Christ and him crucified. And when he would preach the gospel of Christ. And when they would be obedient to the apostle of Christ. Christ being the chief apostle. But nobody would be thinking that they would be under the spell or the agreement of the Apostle Paul if he did not have the Spirit of God to teach them what the Spirit gave him utterance to teach them. Now, branches are those which supply strength from the trunk. And as these branches supplied these people with truths, and the church sprang up or came into existence, or people obeyed the gospel in those towns where they lived, then the fruit that was there would be something that would be born because the branch had received from the trunk the life, the message, the teaching of the Word of God that they had to preach in order for people to be saved. But they didn't belong to the preacher. They belonged to Christ. In 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, and the 10th through about verse 15 to 16, the Apostle Paul went through those who thought that they were following men and not Christ. He said, "Some say thou art of Paul, some say thou art of Cephas, some say thou art of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul?" The answer to all that is absolutely not. Well, since that is true, why have this division that you're trying to come about with in order just to have confusion? See, the beauty of the scriptures or the Word of God is that we all might be one, John 17:17, that the world may believe that God sent Christ. So when somebody is talking about congregations of the churches of Christ, they're talking about representatives of God that live in different cities, that worship in a congregation in which they don't work as to make a living, who are involved in doing other things and then coming back home to their families on the weekend. It is true that those who do such things have a little harder life than men who don't. But sometimes you got to go where the work is. And so when the Apostle Paul would be preaching the gospel and there would be strangers from Rome there, he knew that message would get back to Rome before he got there, because the emissary of that message would take it, go to the assembly of the churches of Christ, and there have somebody exegete, espouse, or explain it to them. Thank you.